Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar, Demystifying ISO 27001. I'm Tim Pinnell, and I'm your host for the next 45 minutes. But before I get into the meat of the subject, a bit about NQA for those of you who've not previously attended one of our webinars. NQA is a world-leading certification body with global operations. We're #1 for aerospace certification in the US. We're top 3 in the UK for 9,000, 14,000, 45,000 and 27,001, and we're #1 in the Chinese automotive certification sector. We specialise in management system certification for quality, aerospace and automotive quality, environmental and energy, health and safety, information resilience, which includes information security, privacy and business continuity, food safety, risk management and medical devices. We offer a range of training for all our specialisms, including virtual learning, webinars such as this, in-house training on your premises, restrictions permitting of course, and we can provide training at various public nationwide locations. And a bit about me. I head up NQA's Information Assurance Business Unit, where I specialise in information security, privacy and business continuity. And this is a result from a long career in security, compliance and governance, and with a track record of running multiple information security management systems. So I have sat on the other side of the table from the auditor, and I know what it's like to be audited. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box as soon as you think of them, and then I can hopefully answer them during the Q&A at the end. As ever, with all NQA webinars, you'll receive a recording of the webinar from our marketing team. Now, many organisations have realised the benefits of being certified to a management system standard, such as ISO 9001, but for whatever reason, wanting to either extend or certify to ISO 27001 for information security. But information security can seem a daunting task, with a variety of disciplines and often seemingly unfathomable terms for the uninitiated, particularly for those organisations that don't have in-house expertise. And they may have heard anecdotally that 27001 has some significant differences not found in other standards. Well, it does. And so this webinar is intended to demystify and clarify the differences. In particular, I'm going to compare and contrast ISO 9001 and 27001, which are the most commonly paired standards when 27001 is involved. Then I'll take you through the heavy lift elements of 27001. That's the risk assessment and the risk treatment, which are reasonably straightforward but require some understanding of information security, which is why I'd always encourage the use of an experienced consultant to guide your 27001 journey. I've carried out some analysis of where organisations go wrong in their risk assessment and treatment, resulting in non-conformities during the audit. And then I want to finish on a hot topic during the pandemic, which is the use of managed service providers in a 27001 context, and how you really should be holding them to account. You can download this Annex SL comparison tool from NQA's website. It lists all those standards on a subclause by subclause basis to show the similarities and the differences. It's particularly useful if you're considering an integrated management system. The text surrounded in an orange box is where the text in the standard is, to all intents and purposes, the same. That said, where there are differences, such as clause 4.4 on screen there, the requirements are still very similar. Annex SL is simply a standardization of the management system clauses, whilst also allowing for the subject matter differences. Differences such as clause 8, where in 9001 most of the heavy lifting is carried out, where it's all about the processes to produce quality products for customers, whereas in 27001 there is very little to be said in section 8. 27001 doesn't care about customers, for example. And over the next few slides, I'll do a detailed clause-by-clause comparison of 9001 and 27001. Whereas in 27001, the heavy lifting takes place in clause 6. In particular, 6.1.2 Information Security Risk Assessment, and 6.1.3 Information Security Risk Treatment. 6.1.3 also introduces the Statement of Applicability, which is unique to 27001. The Statement of Applicability, or SOA, is a list of 114 security controls in 14 groups, A.5 to A.18, that are defined in Annex A of 27001. I'll show later how we use Annex A to create the Statement of Applicability. The important point to note here is that the 114 security controls are considered to be information security industry best practice. So an organization implementing them is placing itself in a strong position to defend its information assets. So clause 4, and the context of the organization in both standards is almost identical, except for 4.4, where I've highlighted the words "and its processes." So although we conduct process-based audits, 27001 is not a process standard as such. But actually, I'll audit the security controls operating on processes, and in order to do that, the process is audited. In clause 5, the big difference is 5.1.2, customer focus, which, as I said, is not a consideration at all for 27001. In all other respects, they are the same, where, for example, in 9001, 5.2.1 and 5.2.2 are rolled up into 5.2 in 27001. Now, all Annex SL standards have 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities, but it's in 6.1.2 and 6.1.3 where you'll spend your time in 27001, as we'll see later. Although all the standards are risk-based, it's explicit in 27001 and very important to get it right, again, as we'll see later. 6.2 are the same, but 27001 doesn't have a 6.3. Instead, there's an Annex A security control for change management, but that is for managing changes to security controls, not to the management system. To 9001, support is a very important clause. And here we can see the focus on making stuff, not just the management system, but people, infrastructure, environment, monitoring, and knowledge are really important to 9001. Whereas 27001 only says the organization shall determine and provide the resources necessary for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the ISMS. Nonetheless, it's still a clause which will be audited and for which evidence must be provided. And I've included the rest of clause 7 here just to show that they are identical. Now, clause 8. Remember how the meat of 9001 was in clause 8? All 27001 requires is that the organization conducts the risk assessment and risk treatment specified in clause 6. Clause 8 is not audited as such, although if a risk assessment has not been conducted or the risk treatment plan not implemented, then non-conformities can be raised against clause 8. In clause 9, the only real difference between the two standards is measuring customer satisfaction, which 27001 doesn't care about. Of course, in an integrated management system, there are good economies of scale and efficiencies to be had in the internal audit program, where if you're auditing a 9001 process, you can audit the security controls it uses as well. And finally, clause 10, where there is no difference. Again, in an integrated management system, you can use the same corrective action process, for example. Okay, that's the compare and contrast done. Let's look at the risk assessment as required by the standard. I've audited countless variations on this, and typically, as management systems mature, the risk assessment and the risk treatment becomes more mature and sophisticated. I recommend, as does the standard, that you obtain a copy of ISO 31000, which is the ISO's guidance for performing risk assessments. I've broken out each step as required by the standard into 4 parts. The first is where you define the risk assessment process, and in particular criteria for accepting risks, criteria for when risk assessments should be carried out, which ensure that risk assessments are repeatable and consistent. That is, if you performed the same risk assessment again, you or someone else would come up with similar results. There's no getting away from the fact that risk assessments are very subjective. I've seen all sorts of tools and methods in spreadsheets and apps, but ultimately they rely on informed opinion, and typically with a lack of data to support those opinions. So anything you can do to make them consistent, that is the risk assessments, regardless of who performs them, is really important. Part 2 is where you think of what kind of risks could hurt the organization. But these are security risks to your information, and they're based on the tenets of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA of information security. And each risk must have an owner. An unowned risk is uncontrolled and a failing of the management system and the organization. Now, part 3 is the really subjective part. First of all, you estimate the impact of something going wrong, which is not too hard, in that you may have some experience of the costs of fixing problems and keeping customers happy. But then you have to guesstimate the likelihood of something bad happening, which is where many people struggle, as we'll see. Once you have the impact and likelihood, you can plug the numbers into a simple formula or matrix to calculate the overall risk level for each risk. In part 4, you take your risks and compare them with your criteria to decide which are the most scary and need something done to help your CEO sleep at night. So here's part 1, where we define criteria. In this case, I've said, I'll accept any risk that scores less than 6 or is rated as moderate. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute. But I'll treat, that is mitigate, any risk that is 6 or rated high or above, or causes a revenue loss of more than 20%, or could harm the company's reputation, or causes harm to my employees, whether it be their privacy rights, for example, or even physical harm. Finally, if the business is doing something that attracts an extreme rating, I've decided that whatever I'm doing is too risky, so I'm going to stop doing it. I will terminate it. I could also add another category of transfer, such as deciding to insure against a risk rather than mitigating it. I then define criteria for when I'm going to perform assessments. In general, those are when an event triggers the need. But note that I've also decided to conduct a risk assessment every year, which is just good practice. And then I've defined criteria for impact and likelihood. Note how that, as well as terms and levels, I've also provided a qualitative description and quantitative values to help guide thinking, which is really important for the repeatability. But of course, you would define criteria that works for you. So now we have to identify the information security risks. And here I've invented 7 risks for my fictional organization. Note how I've listed in the second column the information asset, but that some of them, the website, database, and laptops down at the bottom, are actually information-bearing assets. So it's good practice to assess risks to those as well. And then I list each risk by whether it's a confidentiality, integrity, or availability risk, followed by the risk description. Me and my fictional learned colleagues in this fictional organization have described each risk as cause and effect. All too often, I see risk descriptions that are not fully formed and as such can't be considered a risk. Often the auditee has to describe to me what the risk is, which by the very nature of the thing means it's not a repeatable process. So you can see for risk 1 that the cause is a phishing attack that led to a data breach, and the impact was an ICO fine and reputational damage. There's an important point here. In this example, not all personal data breaches cause a negative impact. It might be such a low level that it's handled as BAU. Therefore, when you're in a room full of wise folk conjuring up potential risks to the organization, you should only concentrate on the risks that really matter. I've seen some risk assessments with hundreds of rows in a spreadsheet, which just becomes harder to manage. Risk 2 is another risk to customer data, only this time it's an availability risk. But I could also have multiple confidentiality risks to customer data, and so on and so on. Note the laptop theft risk. In this case, I've assumed that the laptops are encrypted, so I'm not worried about the data falling into the wrong hands, just that for a short time the owner can't do anything until they get back into the office, which is why I've called it an availability risk. And finally, every risk is assigned an owner. For audit purposes, it's good practice to obtain acknowledgements from those owners. Now, this is where we take the impact and likelihood criteria to each risk and then calculate an overall risk rating using the new table in the middle. For risk 1, I've assessed that the impact would be over 10 million and that it could happen every 6 months, which results in a very high risk rating. Whilst the impact is easier to work out, we're attempting to predict the future when we assess likelihood. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have access to Carol Kirkwood's Met Office supercomputers in order to make predictions about future information security events. So it's always going to be best efforts. I recommend you don't go for the easy middle ground of it might or it might not happen. That doesn't really help business decision making. So stick your neck out and go for the ends of the scale. This is best achieved by discussion with a bunch of people who know the business, its operating environment, and ideally including someone with information security experience. And now I prioritize the risks. Which are the ones that I worry about the most? And these are prioritized, and you can see here that risk 1 followed by risk 4 and so on are my selected order. Risks 6 and 7 are low enough to be way down the pecking order. Now that I've analyzed the risks, I've got to do something about them. Or do I? Let's have a look. 6.1.3 is broken down into these steps, which is where we will involve those industry best practice controls in Annex A to produce the statement of applicability. We start by determining what our options are, and then what security controls we need to introduce to bring the risks down to acceptable levels. We then compile a statement of applicability and create a risk treatment plan, which we must have approved. And having done that, we go back and calculate the residual risk. Note the new leftmost column titled Treatment. I've listed below the criteria for accepting risks. Risk 1 must be treated because it's rated very high, whereas risk 2 I can accept without doing anything more about it because it's only rated moderate. Now that doesn't mean I will ignore it. It will require monitoring, but that's easy to do because it exists in a management system in the plan, do, check, act cycle. And so here we can see that according to my criteria, I'm going to treat risks 1, 3, 4, and 5 and accept risks 2, 6, and 7. Now, I have to determine the necessary controls, and this is where I figure out what I need to do to bring the risks down to acceptable levels. In this case, I'm just going to use risk 1 as the worked example. It's the result of a phishing attack, so I want to improve the training for all staff on how to recognize a phishing email. And then I want to give them a button in Outlook that will quarantine the suspect email and safely forward it to IT to deal with. In addition, I want to procure a phishing detection tool for my email gateway. And then in case phishing malware breaches my defenses, I want to make sure my antivirus software will detect it. But for a belt and braces approach, I want security alerts on the event logs for when suspicious activity is detected. And I don't want access permissions to be abused by the malware, so I'll perform a review on every user's information access. And then because I allow users to access information from their mobile phones, I'll implement a remote mobile device management tool. Now, I compare all of my selected controls with those in Annex A to verify that none have been missed in order to compile a statement of applicability. So, controls 1 and 2 for risk 1 are for phishing training. Here is a screenshot of Annex A controls A.7.2.1 and A.7.2.2, which meet the need of controls 1 and 2. So I'm going to include A721 and 722 in my statement of applicability. And for the phish reporting button in Outlook, I can select A.16.1.2 because it's about reporting a suspected security event. So I include that in my statement of applicability. The automated tool is a control against malware. So I select A.12.2.1. I've also selected A.12.6.2 because another control against malware is to use Active Directory policies to prevent the installation of unapproved software. Having the conversation with my antivirus provider to determine if their software can detect phishing attack payloads is part of monitoring and reviewing the services of suppliers. So I add A.15.2.1 to the statement of applicability. 12.4 is about logging and monitoring, which nicely supports the aspiration for my automated event alerting and log analysis tool. So I've selected all the controls from A.12.4 for the statement of applicability. Section A.9 in Annex A is all about access control. There are many controls I could have selected from A.9, but I've picked those which I think are the most relevant, in particular the review of access rights, A.9.2.5. And finally, for the mobile device management control, I've selected A.6.2.1, mobile device policy, but I've also, again, selected A.7.2.2 for training because mobile users will need specific training. And I do the same for all the other controls I determined necessary for all the other risks. So now we have to produce a statement of applicability, and having compared the controls, my statement of applicability is starting to take shape. Note that the statement of applicability must list all of the 114 Annex A controls. You should state whether or not a control is included or excluded and provide a justification. In this example, I've just listed a few controls to demonstrate the kinds of justification you might consider using. With A.5.1.1, I didn't map it to a control, but I've included it anyway because security policies are a general security requirement, regardless, and in fact are the first control against all risks. With A.6.2.1, you'll recall it was mapped to one of the controls for risk 1. For A.7.2.2, I've mapped it to risk 1 and some other risks. But also, as with all Annex SL standards, there are requirements for communications and awareness. For A.12.2.1, I've included it in order to treat risks 1 and 2, but notice the implementation status are partial. The standard requires you to state whether or not the control is implemented. And in this case, I'm saying not yet, but it's part of a plan. It's part of my risk treatment plan. Your auditor will like that. A.14.2.1 is a commonly excluded control. Many organizations don't do software development, and simply that is the justification for excluding it. And let's jump to 18.1.4 at the bottom. Again, I've not mapped it to a risk treatment control, but because I do business in the UK, I've listed it as the legislation that I need to comply with. As a reminder, you need to do this for all 114 Annex A controls when you're compiling the statement of applicability. And this is usually done in a spreadsheet or a Word document. You then have to formulate a risk treatment plan. On screen is just an example. Every organization has its own way of project management and managing plans and so on. But the point is the standard requires you to have risk treatment plans. And here you can see I've listed the risk treatments for risk 1. The auditor will want to see your risk treatment plan or plans, however you choose to do it. And the auditor will want to see that you're monitoring progress and performance against each risk treatment plan. And finally, for risk treatment, each risk owner must have approved the plans to treat their risks. Emails will suffice as evidence. Then you calculate residual risk. The three rightmost columns are a recalculation of the risk as if the controls had been fully implemented. Notice for risk 1 that despite all those controls, the impact hasn't changed. That's because a big breach is a big breach. But I have brought the likelihood down and therefore the risk level. But it's still rated high, so according to my criteria, I should continue to treat it. Instead, I ask the risk owner to approve it. If they don't, I have to find more ways to mitigate the controls. The other risks I have brought down to acceptable levels. And also note, I haven't run a residual risk calculation for risks 2, 6, and 7 because I didn't need to treat them in the first place. And that's it for the most significant elements of 27001. Now, hopefully I persuaded you to give it a go. I hope, therefore, that the next bit is also equally useful to you. This is when things go wrong. I conducted an analysis of all the clause 6.1.2 and 6.1.3 non-conformities recorded in NQA's database. What you see is the result of that analysis, which can be broadly broken down into a lack of conformant documentation or not following the standard or defined processes. Of these, there's a few I want to call out, which from experience cause difficulties for clients and sometimes consultants as well. Firstly, the RA-RT-SO linkage broken. That's the risk assessment, risk treatment, statement of applicability linkage is broken. Hopefully you'll have seen that there's a flow from identifying risks through to treating those risks to selecting Annex A controls for the statement of applicability. Sometimes we just can't see that linkage or flow, or the client can't explain it. If we can't see it as auditors, then it suggests that the process hasn't been followed and there's something wrong in the overall risk process. Another one I want to talk about is where the statement of applicability content has not been justified. Now, I can understand how they can be missed off, an odd one or two, because 114 is a lot to wade through, but otherwise there is no excuse for missing justifications out, and the standard doesn't allow any leeway. And then finally, I want to call out missing risks. My fellow auditors and I have been at this for many years, and we've all got a background in information security. We know what to expect. We know what the typical risks are, and if they are obviously missing, we will call them out as non-conformities. I started the brief by going straight to 6.1.2 and 6.1.3, but in order to clarify some misunderstandings, I must also discuss 6.1.1. I've audited many organizations who have conducted the risk assessment under 6.1.2 and claimed it covers 6.1.1. They're not the same risk assessment. 6.1.1 is about risks to the management system, and that's common across all the Annex SL standards, whereas 6.1.2 is about risks to information. You don't need to conduct a full risk assessment for 6.1.1, but you do need to have plans to treat the risks. And there on the slide, you can see I provided some example risks and opportunities to the ISMS. Clients often get information security objectives wrong as well. The standards requirements are quite specific. So I've listed the typical causes of non-conformities, from which, again, I want to call a couple out. Objectives not being derived from the security policy and not taking into account the risk assessment and treatment means they are objectives that have been conjured up from somewhere else. The whole point of the management system is that it's all joined up and pulling in the same direction. And then sometimes the objectives are words only, they're slideware only, with no plans in place or forms of measurement. Of course, SMART is always a good idea. And therefore, it is often a suggestion that the objectives are not relevant or pertinent to the management system. I promised I'd talk about the use of managed service providers. Increasingly during the lockdown, I've seen organizations outsourcing large swathes, if not all their IT, to external providers. This usually means that the external providers are also operating many of the organization's security controls. But how good are they? How do the organizations know if the security controls are performing as they should do? Clause 9.1 is quite specific, is quite explicit. The organization shall determine what needs to be monitored and measured, including information security processes and controls. It doesn't allow you to outsource and forget. If you're not doing the monitoring of your security controls, then who is? Demand relevant and timely reporting on your security controls. Seek assurance that they're applying critical patches in short order, that your firewalls and antivirus is repulsing attacks, and so on and so forth. Now, this may mean that you need to revisit the contract with your managed service provider, because it's something that some of them don't do as standard, but I'm pleased to report they are slowly waking up to it. Now, today I've covered the similarities and differences between 9001 and 27001, and then concentrated on the major difference, the information security risk assessment and treatment, and then followed it up with some advice on how to avoid common pitfalls. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and that you're persuaded to implement ISO 27001 in addition to your existing management system. And now it's time for Q&A. So just bear with me and I'll Have your questions up? Oh, plenty of questions already. Thanks very much. First question, is it advisable to refer to ISO 22301 when assessing A17 of ISO 27001? Well, A17, yes, is information security aspects of business continuity. Certainly, if you are certified to ISO 22301 or have implemented some form of 22301 compliant business continuity set of measures that are appropriate to the scope of your 27001 certification, then absolutely refer to them. You've probably done the best thing you can do, but they must be relevant to it. The next question said, there is a 6-year time gap between the two standards. I don't quite understand the question. I'm not sure if referring to 22301 and 27001. If you can clarify that question, that would be great. Thank you very much. Then I have from Gandhi, which risk assessment approach is better, asset-based or process-based? They're either better or worse than each other, and you could certainly do them in conjunction with each other. Both of them will bring out different aspects of risk. They'll bring out a different way of looking at potential impacts to your organization. So I would certainly recommend both approaches. From Sandley, has the determination of the risk level at the guest stage taken into account the existing controls? That's a good point, because as you saw when we do the residual risk treatment, residual risk calculation, that's following the risk treatment plan. The answer is when you're doing it at the first stage, then yes, you take into account the existing controls. Absolutely. I have seen some organizations that perform the risk assessment if they were to assume nothing was in place. And I don't see the value in that, because everything is exposed and everything is vulnerable. So yes, perform the risk assessment based on your existing set of controls. If you find as a consequence that your existing set of controls aren't sufficient, then your risk treatment plan should bring the risks down to an acceptable level, which you calculate in the residual risk calculation stage. During audit for certification, can a control be not fully implemented? That's from Georgios. Absolutely it can, if it's not fully implemented, but from an auditor's point of view, what I want to see is that you are doing something about that control. Either some top management has decided to accept the consequences of the control not being fully implemented, or you've got plans in place to fully implement the control, and you're working towards it. A partially implemented control left hanging is not a good place to be. It won't help your organization at all. Claire, or I assume you're not on the call anymore. I got called to an urgent meeting. Will there be a recording? Absolutely. There will be, every attendee will be sent a recording of this webinar. Alan has said, is penetration testing always necessary? No, it's not. It really does depend on your risk profile, your risk appetite, the kind of industry you're in, the extent to which you have an internet presence or information assets that are accessed over the internet. If you take Cyber Essentials, for example, there are two levels to that, but ostensibly there's an element of vulnerability assessment only. So no, penetration testing is not always necessary, but I would say they're a very good thing to have if you can afford them. Suraj, I'm not sure your question. Please ensure risk, deviation, and treatments. If you can clarify that question in the question and answer box, that would be great. Thanks very much. And Fatah, you've asked how to planning. Again, sorry, I'm not sure what question you're asking there. Rick Belston, how does 27,001 compare with 45,001 and 14,001 in terms of compliance obligations? I assume you mean there in terms of compliance obligations by applicable legislation. If that's the case, there is some fairly specific legislation that would set the context of the organization from an information security point of view, such as the Data Protection Act, the Computer Misuse Act, and so on and so forth. But with most of these standards, when you're defining the context of the organization, there's often a much broader list than that goes beyond the subject matter. but the point is they're Annex SL standards, so they have a broadly a similar requirement in terms of compliant obligations. So Mihaela, you've tried a clarification. Yes, the time gap referred to the two standards. I'm not sure what you mean, but I'm sorry, this is not the ideal environment for clarification, but I'm not sure what you mean by the time gap referred to the two standards, which time gap you're referring to. Yeah. Fanta, you've clarified your question, how to make planning of internal audit, requirements approach or process approach. Well, the requirements are in the standard. However, you will be operating a set of processes in your organization. So first of all, from an auditor's point of view, I would expect you to meet the requirements of the standard, but you could cover off those requirements by operating a process approach. And particularly if you have attached 9001, attached 27001 to 9001, you're operating in a process environment anyway, with a start, a set of transformation processes, and a bunch of outputs. That's a very good way of conducting your internal audits, as long as you make sure you've covered off the requirements within the standard. And as I referred to earlier, you can audit the security controls that operate on the processes that you have. Bear in mind that the process approach might not cover all of your security controls. But essentially both work together. Suraj. So you've just talked about risk, deviation, and treatments, and you clarified that, I think, by saying as they're categorized into major, minor, critical, and how different they are from 9001 and 27001. Again, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to understand what you mean there. In terms of the audit standards, there's no difference in major and minor non-conformities. They're the same whether it's 9001 or 27001. In terms of risk, if you mean major and minor risks or critical risks, well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to guess at what your question is here, but actually 9001 doesn't really talk about it in the same manner. Perhaps you can drop me an email and we can answer your question more properly. You told us that the flow is RA, RTP, SOA. Can we reverse the flow? i.e., can we perform the statement applicability first by interviewing department heads or relevant key personnel to get a picture of the existing implementation at their company? Typically, when you've got a group of wise folk together performing the risk assessment, they know the organization. They're able to bring that information into the discussion. And so, yes, you could work backwards, but this is meant to be a risk-driven approach. So it may well be that you start with the risks and you start with the SAO and you meet in the middle with the risk treatment plan. So you can identify a bunch of risks and then someone else can say, yes, we have logging and monitoring in place, and that can help inform your risk treatment plan and whether or not you need additional logging and monitoring, for example. Ryan has asked, what is the most controls you have ever seen excluded and they passed the audit? I like that question. 4, I think, is the most I've ever seen excluded. Bear in mind that the Annex A controls are industry best practice. So it's there are very few occasions where you don't include those controls. I would also recommend that people get hold of a copy of ISO 27002, which is information security guidance. It offers guidance for all of the Annex A controls. It's a really useful document. Okay, Vivek, does A17 require business continuity planning, or will it suffice if information security aspects during a crisis are met outside a dedicated business continuity plan? Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll get a copy of the standard and have a quick look through it. It does talk about the requirement for information security aspects of business continuity. And it says the organization shall determine its requirements for information security and the continuity of information security management in adverse situations. So typically you'd have a business continuity plan, but it's up to you to determine how you're going to do it. And it then expects you to establish and document and maintain processes for information security continuity. And then it goes on to expect you to rehearse and practice those measures. Again, business continuity planning is probably the best way of doing it. But you don't have to, but you do have to comply with A17, however you choose to do it. Do we need to audit all controls annually? You need to audit all controls within the certification cycle. What we're looking for in the when we're doing the audit, that the organization is operating that continual improvement cycle. And when I come in and do the audit, I will do a sample of the controls over 3 years. So you could do the same. And I'm presuming here you're talking about the Annex A controls, not the management system requirements. The question is really for the organization. What do you need to check, monitor, and measure to make sure that your security controls are performing correctly? So that works with clause 9.1 as well. If your view of the, so this is from Julie, if your view of the impact of a risk differs from that of your assessor, as long as you provide an explanation, will this suffice, or will they make recommendations for improvements? Yes, and possibly yes. I've seen it where an organization has assessed a risk, and I have seen an element of that risk which I believe is not correct, or they've missed out. And I can discuss that with the organization. And as long as the organization has got a fully formed argument for why it is what it is, it's the organization's risk, it's not mine. If I think they're way off the mark, I could certainly recommend some improvements to them. And if it's completely not off the mark, it might even be a non-conformity. But that's not always going to be the case. But yeah, as long as the organization is able to correctly justify why or what not is their risk, then that will suffice. Will the session be uploaded anywhere for catch-up viewing? Edward, you'll be sent a copy of this. Can a risk owner be a department or a number of people? Ideally, not a department. We can assign it to a role rather than named individual, because of course individuals move from in and out of roles, but if the role owns it. The standard talks about ownership. The important thing in the standard is that you demonstrate that ownership is there and it's active, it's a living thing. It's not just a box ticking exercise. Hanumantha, your question, how to integrate cybersecurity in ISMS? Well, I don't fully get the question, but cybersecurity, information security, IT security, the sort of descriptions are by and large the same thing, particularly where organizations are conducting business or internet connected, which is particularly about cybersecurity. The point is that ISO 27001 embraces all aspects of information security, regardless of where they sit. I should also add there are bolt-on standards for cloud security, such as ISO 27017, which further embrace the cybersecurity concept. Septia, sorry, I just lost your question. Just going back up. If the company have existing risk matrix, risk assessment, risk treatment based on 31,000, 9,001 and other sites, should we make another basis due to 27,001? No, if it's based on 31,000, you're in a really good place. The important thing is that the risk treatment has that statement of applicability in it. And if you can demonstrate in an audit that you've got a fully formed and functioning risk assessment process, then no, well done, and you should be congratulated for doing it. Please don't have a second go at it, because it'll just make it more difficult. Anthony, would you recommend ISO 30? You recommended ISO 31000. Would you recommend ISO 27005 instead or in addition? 31000 is it? I thought it had been. I thought 31000 had replaced 27005 anyway. Stephen, thanks very much. Nice feedback there. Yeah, it seems not a question. He's making a statement. I completely get where you're coming from. You and I seems to have shared experiences there, so I'm glad that it helps. Ryan, what are the challenges associated with a remote-based organization from a physical security perspective? Will the auditors take a sensible approach with regards to Section 11? Ryan, the lockdown has meant that we are conducting remote audits. And of course, information security is great because it's online and you can do loads of screen sharing and conduct almost the entire audit remotely. So what we've been doing for physical security is somebody has been logging on to a Teams call from their mobile phone and walked around the location. I've been grabbing screenshots and asking them questions and done it like that. So it's been a virtual physical security tour of the premises. Now that's not ideal. We can't guarantee we're getting everything. So going forward, post-pandemic, most auditing organizations are moving to what we call a blended or a hybrid approach, whereby most of the auditing, certainly from a 27001 point of view, will be done remotely, but for certain aspects, such as physical security, we will go on site. And actually that works quite well from a travel point of view. Anthony, you say, would you recommend 27003? Yes, absolutely. The entire 27000 series are excellent. Next one, who ideally are interviewed in order for you or us as consultants to execute the risk assessment process? I know it all depends on the scope of the certification, but who are they ideally and generally? That's a really good question. For a previous organization I worked with, when I was performing the risk assessment, I gathered a whole bunch of people in. So I had people from, I think it's the head of the IT department. I had the customer service department there. I had a solicitor there. I had 2 bean counters there. You need bean counters there. You can talk about impact. I had a privacy expert in there. The more people you can bring in and who are correctly briefed on what you're trying to do, bring in that organizational and contextual knowledge, and really will help you in the first place assess the impacts, work out what the typical impacts are going to be they operational, financial, reputational, and so on and so forth. And as I said, assessing likelihood is much more difficult. But if you've got, say, the security guy there and the IT guy there, they've got a reasonable feeling for when things go wrong from an information security point of view, particularly the security guys. So that helps build that common understanding of what the likelihood of things going wrong are. Harriet, would you recommend seeking compliance with 27001 and 27018 for a service-based security project? Well, I would, because I'm NQA and we're a certification company and we do offer those standards. First of all, they are unaccredited standards, so you would get a 27001 certification, but 27017 would be bolted onto that. 27017 is really good if you're a cloud user or a cloud service provider. You may well be both. 27018 is about privacy in the cloud. You could use that. On the other hand, you could bolt on 27001, which is a privacy information management system as well, but certainly very good standards. How to integrate PIMs in ISMS process? That is the subject of a separate briefing and webinar. More than I can go through in this subject, but that's something we can certainly have discussed in a previous webinar. What if the premises are people's houses? The organization is fully remote. Yes, Ryan, I have come across this. Particularly new startups have got everything in Microsoft Azure and they work in their kitchen table across 3 or 4 houses. Yeah, I'm not going to go in and audit their houses because all they've got is broadband and a laptop. We don't audit those. It begs the question of then what do we do about the physical security audit? Well, that's down then to the risk assessment and the extent to which the organization decides whether or not there are physical security controls in scope. How much of fair risk assessment methodology can be used during risk assessments in an organization where all risk impact criteria don't have financial values associated to them? That's a good question, Vivek. Well, yes, you can use the fair risk assessment methodology. What you have to determine is whether or not it's an appropriate methodology for you. Most or many risk assessments in an information security context affect the bottom line. It's not the same with health and safety, for example. So fair may not be the most appropriate, or maybe you can fine tune or adjust it or combine it with another methodology. Okay. That's the last question. It's now 10 to 3. We've overrun by 5 minutes, but they were great questions, so thanks very much for asking them. I'll close the webinar now. So again, thanks very much for joining, and I hope you found it useful. And as a reminder, again, you will be receiving a copy of this recording from our marketing department. Thanks very much.